Hello, and thank you for joining me. Jesus began his Sermon on the Mount instruction with the Beatitudes. Now, he addressed the entire Sermon on the Mount to his disciples. This is important. We're talking about believers, saved people who are making Jesus, let's say, the king of their lives and are interested in knowing his word that they might acceptably serve him. So, this is the fact that Jesus addressed the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount to his saved disciples. This is a contextual and interpretational landmark from which we must not drift. No part of the Sermon on the Mount is addressed to unsaved people. The Sermon on the Mount is not evangelistic. The Beatitudes give what, by the way, the great theme of the Sermon on the Mount, if you recall, if you've watched previous videos, the great theme of this instruction of the Lord, I like to call it the Lord's kingdom instruction on the hill that he gave to his disciples, but Sermon on the Mount works, that's okay. But the great theme of this teaching is the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. These are synonymous terms. And so the subject of the kingdom is limited in application to believers, and it concerns their lives, their temporal lives, and their Christian service. The Beatitudes, the Lord laid down what are to be the character standards, character qualities of his kingdom subjects. Now, interestingly, Jesus was speaking to people, his Jewish disciples, that they thought they were in his kingdom by virtue of their race, their pedigree. The religion with which they were familiar was focused on external. So we understand that they had been influenced, strongly influenced by Pharisees and their teaching. Much of the Sermon on the Mount, in fact, is corrective. It was corrective. The Lord was correcting the disciples' misconceptions about the kingdom. He was reorienting their thinking, and that's something that I believe many of God's children, because of inadequate teaching or defective, deficient teaching, many of God's people need their thinking reoriented. In the kingdom, remember this, in the kingdom, character is supreme. So the Lord's concern is not so much with what we do, but with who we are in our inner man. So who we are pretty much will take care of what we do and how we treat other people. So what we do, how we live is governed by character, by who we are. And I will say, just as we get ready to read here our text, Matthew 5:7, I will say that Christianity is not something that we put on once or twice a week for an hour or so and then take off. So we're talking about a lifestyle. This is what Jesus taught, a lifestyle. Let's call it an evangelistic lifestyle. So this brings us to the spiritual prosperity of the merciful ones. This is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7. Jesus stated, blessed, or I like to say spiritually prosperous, are the merciful ones, for, here is an objective statement, they, emphatic pronoun, they shall obtain mercy, or more literally, they will be or shall be mercied. Now let me begin this way by saying that the world is a tough place. So the basic mentality is dog eat dog. Somebody once said that it is a dog eat dog world, and I'm going to eat all the dog I can get. Well, there are a lot of people that think that way. The thinking is every man for himself. But what we find throughout the Beatitudes and throughout all of the Lord's teaching, his kingdom standards are higher. We find that the Lord delights in mercy. We'll talk about this in just a moment. And certainly Christians, the Lord teaches us that his servants can afford to be merciful. Multiple ideas are involved in the concept of mercy. Now, negatively, we can it will help us to understand that mercy is the opposite of cruelty. Mercy positively embodies the concepts of pity and compassion. However, we want to understand that mercy is more than a feeling, it is more than an emotion. Mercy, as Jesus teaches here, is a condition of the heart. We can say it is compassion in action. Mercy assumes need on the part of another, and on the part of the one who will be merciful, there is a desire and a commitment to a desire to relieve suffering, and a commitment to do what one can to relieve suffering or to fill a need. Let me say it this way: mercy gets involved in another's difficulties. Now, I think that perhaps the greatest illustration of mercy we find in that parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, you'll read about this in Luke chapter 10 and verses 25 through 37. So, the context is a lawyer, an expert in Jewish religious law, asked Jesus a question: "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said, "Well, you know the law. What does it say?" And that man said, "Well, the law says, number one, the supreme commandment is love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, with all your being." All right, so forth. So I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but love God supremely. And then he said, and after that, the law teaches love your neighbor. So this is a summarization. Love your neighbor as yourself. You remember what Jesus said to the man. He said, well, you do this and you'll live. All right, so the man started thinking, and he's working things through his mind as obviously as he thought the first part, loving God supremely, supreme loyalty to God, he thought he had that all pinned down and worked out, which we know that he didn't, but in his mind he did. But he hit a problem when it came to his neighbor, when it came to his fellow man. And the problem was this: he knew that he did not love all men as he loved himself. So you remember that he asked Jesus a question which prompted the illustration of the Good Samaritan parable. He asked Jesus the question, okay, well then, can you please define for me who is my neighbor? You understand, what he was looking for was a loophole. So we could rephrase the question this way, what he wanted to know: Jesus, who am I required to love, and who is it okay not to love? So then Jesus gave the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man went from Jerusalem down to Jericho. So we assume that he was a Jew, and he got into some bad territory, maybe down in the Wadi Kelt, and he fell among thieves who beat him to pieces and robbed all of his clothes. I guess probably didn't leave him any underwear either, and so left him naked and beat to pieces, half dead, and then they went on their way. So a priest, a religious guy, a Jewish priest came by that way. And I like what Jesus said. He happened that way by chance. Had he known that the man in need, in trouble, was there, he would have gone another way. But he did come down that way. He saw the man, didn't know if he was alive or dead. But, and by the way, he was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho probably. And there were a lot of priests lived in Jericho, but the fact that he was going back home tells us that his religious responsibilities at the temple, he had completed them for the time being. So he comes up upon the beat up man. Again, we assume he was a fellow Jew, and he saw that he was in trouble or had trouble, didn't know if he was alive or dead, but he walked way around that man, didn't get close to him. Well, for one thing, to find out whether the man was alive or dead, he would have had to touch him. And so he was thinking, if I touch it, if he's dead, that will defile me, make me ritualistic unclean. So here was this man that you would expect him to have compassion and be merciful, but he passed on by. He didn't stop. Maybe thinking, poor fool, he probably, no telling what he did, he got what he deserved. All right, so then later on a Levite, now kind of a secondary priest, but still a religious guy, and someone from whom someone in need would expect some help, some compassion. The Levite came by that way, and he walked up a little closer, and he kind of eyeballed things. Again, he didn't know if the beat up man was alive or dead. And so the Levite, he just kind of looked and he thought, wonder what happened here. And he went on his way. He didn't provide any help. Now let me just say, what happened with these men, these two religious men, is their religion had robbed them of their compassion. That is not an uncommon thing, especially with people who get caught up in a legalistic religion. Their religion robs their compassion. Okay, so the two religious guys have come and gone, but now comes along a Samaritan, and you probably know that the Jews and the Samaritans, they did not like each other. They despised each other. The Jews considered the Samaritans Untermensch, subhuman. All right, so the Samaritan comes by, and he's on a business journey. But he sees this man. Obviously, he would have identified him as a Jew, but that didn't matter to him. What he saw was a fellow man in trouble. So you have the story, the Samaritan went to him, and sure enough, the man was alive. The Samaritan poured wine and oil into his wounds, put him upon his own donkey, and took him to an inn, and got him set up, and even he said, here, he gave the innkeeper money and said, take care of this guy until I come back. And if when I come back, I owe you more money for his care, well, then I will pay you more. All right, so a beautiful story, often misunderstood. But Jesus, when he finished that story, he asked the lawyer, so which of the three do you think was neighbor to him who fell among thieves? This is Luke 10:36. And the lawyer, what could he say? He said, he who showed mercy on him. Of course, Jesus said, well, you go and do likewise. And I think the point of the story was that lawyer knew that he wasn't going to love all men like he should. And so the Lord's point was that if you think you're saved by keeping the law, then you've got trouble. And so the point was to bring the lawyer to that place where he said, if I'm saved by works of the law, then I'm either hopelessly lost or God's going to have to provide a gracious way of salvation for me. All right, now, so this parable of the Good Samaritan to me, it's a classic illustration of mercy and how it works. And I like something that John MacArthur said, and I'll quote this to you now. I don't agree with everything he taught, but he did teach a lot of truth, and there are many things that I do agree with him on. But he stated in one place, he said, in every true act of mercy, someone pays the price. To be merciful is to bear the load for someone else. I like that, and I will repeat it again as we get further into the lesson. Now, let me say that genuine mercy is selfless. And I say that because there is a mercy, quote unquote, that is really self-serving and self-seeking. And what I'm talking about is what's come to be called virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is calling attention to oneself that, I care for others. No, most of the time virtue signalers don't care, but they want others to think they care. So this is not mercy. So what I'm saying, there's something in it for the virtue signaler. Now clearly, though conduct is involved, mercifulness is a natural outcome of what one is in his or her heart. Mercy assumes advantage. It assumes a superior position. Generally speaking, one who shows mercy to the other guy has some advantage over him. So an illustration to me is when David, an occasion when he spared King Saul. Saul was trying to kill David. And so he with his army is pursuing David, and he's out in the wilderness. David and his men are on the run. Saul and his army come to a cave. Saul goes into the cave to relieve himself, and what he did not know is that David and his men were hiding in that cave. And so Saul is doing his business, and David and his men are hidden, and David's men said, "Man, God has put this guy into your hands. Go and stick him. Kill him, graveyard dead." David said, No, I can't do that. The point is, David had Saul right in his power. I mean, Saul was in his hand, but David spared, David had mercy on Saul. So when we're talking about mercy, then what one does with the other guy, let's say who hates him or wrongs him, what one does to the other guy when he has the other guy in his power and control, that reveals his character. So let's say I have someone who's done me wrong or someone who hates me. Let's say I've got him. Let's say I've got him by the throat. I've got my hand on his throat. He's helpless. And in my other hand, I have a scalpel. And I've got that scalpel. All I've got to do with a flick of the wrist, I cut his jugular vein and he's gone. What I do with my enemy when I've got him in that situation reveals character. Mercy puts the matter of justice into God's hands. We all struggle with the justice gene, and it only seems fair that those who mistreat us should get their just deserts. Yet mercy has pity and compassion on those who wrong us. Mercy forgives personal wrongs. It takes into consideration such things as ignorance and weakness. Maybe the greatest example of mercy was when Jesus, dying on the cross, surrounded by hard-hearted and hateful people who were killing him, who were delighting in watching him bleed out and die, Jesus prayed for his murderers. You know what he said? "Father, forgive them." Why? Because they don't know what they're doing. Yet we must also be clear, I must be clear to say that mercy does not necessarily mean one always lets things slide. For example, it would not be merciful for a parent to see a child involved in activity, doing things or exhibiting an attitude that would ultimately cause him a lot of trouble. For the parent to say, "Oh, he's just being a kid, I'll let it slide," that would not be merciful. Especially it ends up, one's child ends up in prison. I think the principle of Psalm 141 verse 5 is involved here. David said, "Let the righteous strike me. It shall be a kindness. And let him rebuke me. It shall be as excellent oil. Let my head not refuse it." In other words, when somebody in love points out faults or points out to me that I'm going in a wrong direction and loves me enough to tell me that is a merciful thing. We understand that God is merciful, but never at the expense of his justice. God can be merciful and forgive sins on the basis of Jesus Christ having paid the price for those sins. Now again, to repeat MacArthur's words, in every true act of mercy, someone pays the price. To be merciful is to bear the load for someone else. Okay, so let's talk about the motive of mercy. Sockman, a man named Sockman, I've quoted him in some previous videos. He wrote a good commentary on the Beatitudes. Sockman wrote, "The Christian is to be merciful, not because of the mercy he hopes to receive in the future, but because of the mercy he has received in the past." The classic example, and let me just go ahead and quote Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32. Paul instructed the members of the church at Ephesus, "And be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God in Christ forgave you." A classic example is the parable of the unforgiving servant. Now, this video is going a little longer, so I hope that you'll bear with me. But in the context, Jesus had taught the importance of kingdom servants forgiving their brethren when their brethren mistreat them, sin against them. And so Peter had a little struggle with that, and he asked the question, "Lord, if my brother sins against me and he asks me to forgive him, should I forgive him up to 7 times in a day?" Now, Peter thought he was being really charitable because the rabbis taught you only had to forgive 3 times and then you didn't have to forgive your brother after that. Of course, Jesus said, "I don't say up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. In other words, don't keep score, Peter. Just keep on forgiving. And then Jesus gave that kingdom parable of the unforgiving servant that occurs in Matthew chapter 18. So he said the kingdom of heaven is like a king that called his servants and called them to give account of themselves. And one of his servants was brought into him who owed him an unpayable sum of money. Whether the man had been negligent, we don't know, but for whatever reason, he'd mismanaged, or somehow, he owed his master an unpayable sum. Well, the master commanded, sell him and his family and everything he has, so that I can get something recover something of this debt, and which was a common thing. They could do it in that culture at that time. But that servant then, he fell down at the master's feet and begged him to give me time to pay. I'll pay you. Well, he couldn't pay, of course, but the master, the king, his heart was touched by the circumstances, the hopeless circumstances in which his servant was in. He had compassion on him, and so he did something remarkable. He released him, and he forgave him the debt. He canceled the debt. Wonderful thing. But then that servant, he went right out and he found a fellow servant who owed him a very payable sum. Wasn't very much money, but his fellow servant couldn't pay him just then. So he said, "Man, give me time and I'll pay you." Just like the first servant had said to his master, "Give me time and I'll pay you." But the servant who had been forgiven the debt, he didn't do that. He said, no, I'm going to throw you in debtor's prison and you are going to pay me. Well, when the other servants of the king saw what had happened, they went and told the king, and that servant, that unforgiving servant, was called back in. And so we read in Matthew chapter 18, this verses 32 and 33, "Then his master," this was the master of the king speaking to his servant, "then his master, after he had called him, said to him, 'You wicked servant.'" Now you get this is about servants. "I forgave you all that debt because you begged me." And here are the operative words. "Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you?" Now, interestingly, compassion and pity are the same base word that's translated merciful and mercy in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7, our text. So the New American Standard reads the verse this way: "Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave, even as I had mercy on you?" Now, when we see ourselves as we are, we understand our own constant need for mercy and forgiveness, and this impacts our attitude and our treatment, our attitude towards others, and our treatment of them. We go back and we understand what's been done for us, and the mercy and God and kindness God continues to show us, and that is supposed to touch our hearts, and it will impact how we treat others. Now, the blessing of mercy, the merciful ones are blessed or spiritually prosperous. Jesus said, for they shall receive mercy, or they shall be mercy. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean that those to whom one shows mercy will always show him mercy in return. Now, I say that because Jesus was the most merciful of men, and those to whom he showed mercy slandered him. They ultimately killed him. I think King David's words are helpful. This is 2 Samuel 22:26. David said, with the merciful, he was talking to God, with the merciful you will show yourself merciful. Our Heavenly Father will see to it that when his children are merciful, this will not ultimately cost them anything. Now, I realize, I said earlier, mercy will always cost something, and there is a sense in which it does, but God will see to it that ultimately it will not cost his merciful children anything. By the way, it is a mercy to be able to show mercy. Think about that. The giver, the merciful one, is more blessed than the one who receives mercy. And indeed, in order to be merciful, as Jesus taught about it, we have to overcome some things within us. I'll conclude by saying that a merciless spirit or attitude is not an indicator that one is not saved. Now remember, the Beatitudes, these character qualities, they're not tests of whether or not one is saved. God has children who are merciless. God has children who are cruel. They're his children, but they're cruel. How can they be cruel? They do not see themselves as God sees them. They do not have a proper evaluation of themselves. Doesn't mean they're lost. It just means that they have a warped perspective of things. Many of God's cruel children are in churches, and they are in legalistic churches. So that's the lesson that I have for you. This is a little bit longer than some of the ones I've been putting up, but that's okay. Break it up into 2 viewings if you'd like to. But I do appreciate you joining me in this video. If you like the material, feel free to hit the like button. That would be helpful. If you're not subscribed to my channel, I invite you to do that. That would be helpful as well. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll be putting some more videos up on the Beatitudes. The Lord bless you, and take care. Thanks again.